family was all over Charlestown and Shepherdstown, which is about 10 miles from Charlestown and in the same county, Jefferson County. She had aunts and uncles and cousins everywhere, everywhere. So these are 3 of the known Lane houses in Charlestown that I know of. They're not overly fancy or, so I would say that the Lane family was not overly wealthy. They had houses, but they're not huge houses. I would think that on the one on the bottom, that little overhang there is probably added later. That's actually apartment house. But I walk the streets and I walk by these houses almost every day. So her Lane grandparents, her father's parents were Joseph and Mary Newton Lane. She had uncles. These were all her father's brothers. William, Joseph, Willoughby, James, Thomas, John, and George. They all lived in Charlestown. She had at least 3 aunts there. We don't know what Sarah's married name was. She had Kennedy cousins and Huston cousins and Hunter cousins, and they're just all over the place. So that's my local connection. I was told early on by historians that there wasn't enough information to write a book about Harriet Lane. Well, if you ever want to get me going, just tell me I can't do something. I'm that kind of guy. There wasn't enough information. Well, golly, there is, and some of it I found right in the archives here. There are letters and letters and letters and letters and letters between Harriet and her uncle. He wrote to her, she wrote to him. He wasn't around much. He was a pretty busy guy. And but kept in touch all the time, giving her advice, which she never took, things like that. And Harriet's teachers wrote to him and complained about her. And all her teachers said the same thing. She was a great academic student. She was always in trouble. But they say women don't make it in the history books unless they're a little naughty, right? So she was a lot naughty. So she was born May the 9th, 1830 in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania. That's pretty close to where I live. Nice little community in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, just west of Chambersburg. By the age of 11, both of her parents had died. Her mother died when she was 9. Her father died when she was 11. Now, she was the 6th of 7 children. So she was very, very young. And can't imagine how she would have handled that and how her sister and her brothers, her 5 brothers, would have handled that. So they became under the care of her uncle, James Buchanan. Now, Harriet's mother was James Buchanan's sister. So there's the connection there. She went to school first in Mercersburg. And then after her parents' death, she went to school in Lancaster, and then in Charlestown. In both instances, they were instructed by old maid ladies. And she says this in her notes. The Crawford sisters were her teachers in one of the schools, and she said that they insisted that she not put sugar in her tea. And she asked them why, and they said, because it will have a tendency to throw off your womanly figure. She said, I'm 11. What do I care about my womanly figure? They were very strict in all these schools. And if there was one thing that she was very adamant about, she didn't like to be told to do something. When her parents first died, she went to one of James Buchanan's brothers and his wife, and she said that that the woman would tell her what to do, tell her how to do it, and then stand there and watch her do it to make sure she did it that way. Well, my mom used to do that. She would tell me what to do and how to do it, and then she'd watch me. In fact, when I visited her, I was probably 50 years old. She told me to boil water, get ready for the mashed potatoes, and I started boiling the water. She came out and she said, "We don't boil water in that pan." You know, she had a boiling water pan. Well, I thought you could boil water in any pan. What do I know? You know, I'm just a guy. So yeah, I understand she didn't like her rules. So she ended up going to the visitation school in Washington. It's actually in Georgetown. They were enrolled in 1847, her and her sister. It was a Catholic school operated by the visitation nuns. Now, it's one thing to go to a Catholic school if you're Catholic, but if you're Presbyterian, it's a problem. And her and her sister grew up as Presbyterians. So why did James Buchanan send them there? Because he wanted them to be close, because he was in DC and he wanted to keep an eye on. So her letters indicate that she, in order to cover all her bases, she prayed to the Presbyterian God and she prayed to the Catholic God. Well, you know, that makes sense. The school is still there today. I visited the school. It's very interesting. Her dormitory, her classrooms, and the chapel where they prayed are still there today. The dormitory is the same. From 1847, they're still using it as a dormitory. The nun in charge had files on her because she was one of the most prominent alums of the school. And I asked her if she would show me her file. And old sister, Madame Anne, got a big smile on her face because she couldn't wait to show me, because I asked to see if there were cases that we could trace that Harriet got in trouble in the school. And of course there were. Now, when I wrote the book, this nun was 93. So she didn't have much to do, but she was keeping the history of the school, and she was really glad to show me around and tell me all the trouble that Harriet got into in the school. Now, one of the school's mottos fit Harriet very well. Comes from St. Francis de Sales, and it says, "Be who you are and be that well." Well, she fit right into that, because even when she was bad, she was really good at being bad. She was one of the best ones there in being good and one of the best ones there in being bad. So what happens in a Catholic school is if you smile during the prayer or you giggle or something, you get extra prayers at night. And she talks about every single night, into the night, she was doing her penance for all her minor discretions. She was also the school's top student, so that fit in with what we said before. She was very smart, smarter than anybody there, but she didn't want to toe the line. She wanted to be her own person. So here's what the visitation school looks like back then, and it looks the same. Now, what's interesting in the chapel, and she pointed this out, is that the girls were in the loft and the nuns were on the ground floor. She said that was the only time that she was closer to heaven than the nuns were. So let's look at Uncle James, which you probably know more about than I do. He was born in Cove Gap, which is right outside of Mercersburg. He was an attorney, made lots and lots and lots of money as an attorney right here. He served in the Pennsylvania legislature and then in the House and in the Senate of the US government. He was minister to Russia and then ambassador to the United Kingdom. Recently, when Hillary Clinton ran for president, she bragged that she had more. She would, if she was become president, she would have more experience than anybody ever in the history of the United States. And I said, wrong. She couldn't touch James Buchanan with a 10-foot pole. He had way more experience than she ever dreamed of having. He was Secretary of State and was the 15th US president right before Abraham Lincoln. He's also the only bachelor president. And some people say the only gay president. I don't know what they teach here on the grounds here, but he lived with Rufus King, William Rufus King, a member of Congress, for 41 years. How does Harriet handle that? She says in her notes that Rufus had a daughter, that her and Rufus's daughter found letters between the two of them and they burned them. So we couldn't read them. So that might indicate that there were things in there that she didn't want us to know. Who knows? Now, what her uncle did do was very rare in her time. When they had dinners at Wheatland, after dinner, the men would go in this room over here, get their cigars out, and talk about things the guys talk about. And the ladies would go over there, and Harriet would go over here. He let her sit in on those meetings. She listened for quite a while, and then she started to participate. That's very rare. That was a very rare opportunity that her uncle gave her at a very young age. And that helped develop her into the person that she became. So James Buchanan was appointed as a minister to the United Kingdom, to the court of St. James, the fall of 1853. And he invited Harriet to join him in the spring of 1854. While she was there, she was a hit. Everybody loved her in the UK. She also befriended Queen Victoria. And this is Queen Victoria and her husband at that time. Now, the secretary to James Buchanan in the UK was somebody that you've probably heard of, Daniel Sickles. Anybody ever heard of him? She became friends with Sickles' wife, Teresa. Teresa was a very good-looking lady, much younger than Daniel Sickles. But Harriet didn't have a lot of friends over there, although everybody loved her, and she befriended Sickles' wife. So Sickles insulted the queen and got sent home. So there's part of her support system went with her. So Sickles is much more known as being a Civil War general who lost his leg in Gettysburg. In fact, Sickles is a little strange beyond that, in that he visited his leg at the Medical Museum in Maryland on the anniversary that it was cut off every year. That's a little odd. But we have more on Sickles in a minute. So Harriet was very well endowed, shall we say. and she liked to show that part off. And she had multiple suitors. Everybody wanted to date Harriet. She had multiple offers of marriage, including when she was in the UK. One was from a 65-year-old British jurist, Sir Fitzroy Kelly. And this is so outrageous that it's worth talking about. He was a multimillionaire. Now, her uncle encouraged her to befriend men that were much older than her. And Sir Fitzroy Kelly was much older than her. In fact, he was 41 years older than her. But I guess if you're a multimillionaire, you can overlook that, right? Here's what he looked like. Doesn't he look like a fun guy? Oh my goodness. Could you imagine looking over the table every day, every morning at breakfast, that face? Just thinking, when is he going to die? So as you know, James Buchanan purchased the estate here called Wheatland in 1848 and moved in 1849. Now, the people that lived here before didn't stay here in the winter. So the house had some things missing that you and I might want to have had if we lived here, and one of them was a furnace, didn't have a furnace. So Harriet was the mistress here, and she loved it here. And he was gone all the time, and she had pretty much the run of everything. So it had a dining room table that sat 22 people at a time. How many of you have a dining room table that fits 22? None of you? He had a bathtub in his house. That was pretty rare at that time. And central heating. Central heating in the 1850s. Because it gets cold in Pennsylvania in the winter. Had a library, carriage house, a privy, and an ice house. As you know, because you've already visited. There's a drawing and a photograph. Beautiful house, beautiful house. So he was gone all the time. So she had the complete run of it. The house had an elaborate bell system where you could summon a servant at most any time. And she had a bell right by her bed, which she could summon the servant to bring her whatever she wanted, tea or whatever. And a doorbell system. Again, all of these are very strange for that time period, very, very much not in a normal house. So James Buchanan was pro-slavery, and Harriet was really troubled by slavery. He had purchased 2 slave girls in 1835 from Harriet's aunt, Anne Henry of Shepherdstown. Now, Shepherdstown's right about 10 miles from where I am. So I went looking for the bill of sale in the courthouse, and I found it. Here's what it looked like. And you say, well, Mr. O'Connor, I can't read that. Well, I'll blow it up for you. Well, you probably can't read that either, so I'll read it for you. No, all men, by these men that I, Anne D. Henry, widow of Shepherdstown in the county of Jefferson and the state of Virginia, for the consideration of the sum of $250 paid to me by James Buchanan, Esquire, of the city of Lancaster in the state of Pennsylvania, the receipt of which is hereby acknowledged, do by these present manumit and set free my 2 family slaves, Daphne Cook, age 22 on the 22nd day of October last, and her daughter Ann Cook, age 5 on the 22nd day of February. Now there's a little more to it, but I want to explain a couple things first. Number one, James Buchanan could not bring slave girls into Pennsylvania. It was not legal. So what did Anne do? She freed them. And then she sold them to her anyway. How does she get away with that? Upon the express condition, however, that the said Daphne shall be bound to the laws of Pennsylvania to serve the said James Buchanan, his executors, administrators, or assigned during the term of 7 years from the date herein, and also that the said Anne shall be like manner be bound to serve James Buchanan, his executors, administrators, or assigned until she shall attain the age of 28. She sold them to him as indentured servants because indentured servants were legal in Pennsylvania. Now I ask you, what's the difference between being a slave and being an indentured servant? An indentured servant had a term, and a slave didn't. You were a slave for life. But look at the term. Daphne would serve for 7 years, and her daughter, who was 5, would serve for 23 years. Now they say people try to trick the government so they don't have to pay as much taxes. Well, even back in these days, they were trying to get around the law. So instead of selling him slaves, which she couldn't do, she sold him indentured servants, which was okay. And in my mind is exactly the same thing. Interesting. Slaves were not allowed in Pennsylvania. Indentured servants were allowed. The 2 indentured servants, Daphne and her daughter, worked at Wheatland for Harriet. She didn't know they were indentured servants. Visitation School also owned slaves. Now, why would a Catholic nunnery own slaves? Because they were either willed to the school by people that owned them, and when they died, they gave their property to the church or to the school. Or girls that came to the school brought their slave with them and left them there at the school after they graduated. But who would have thought that a Catholic school would have slaves? That just kind of freaked me out. So James Buchanan lived at 4 East King and then moved to 42 East King. Now I'm at the Marriott. That's right at the corner of King and Queen. Thaddeus Stevens lived at 45 South Queen. So the roads came together. So their 2 backyards practically touched. Thaddeus Stevens, you know him from the movie Lincoln by Spielberg. He was the man who had a wig that was round, and he didn't want to have to look in the mirror to put his wig on, so he got a round wig, so he just slap it on his head and go off to work. So they lived right around the corner. Buchanan was a Freemason. Freemasons believed in the Supreme Being and banned women, among other things. And Stevens was anti-Mason and had called for Congress to investigate the evils of Freemasonry. So these guys were neighbors, and they were both in the government in Washington. And one was a Freemason, the other one was an anti-Mason, and one was anti-slavery. And guess what? Stevens had a tunnel in the basement of his house that was part of the Underground Railroad. So he was running slaves right under Buchanan's nose. Pretty amazing for a couple of neighbors. Mr. Whipper, a colored man, drove the buggy and the carriage for James Buchanan. Harriet found out that Mr. Whipper was also involved in the Underground Railroad. So all these people are working directly with her uncle, but were on opposite sides of his views. Interesting. James Buchanan did not know that his neighbor and his driver were helping fugitive slaves. He would have been furious. And Harriet wasn't going to tell him, of course. So James Buchanan became president March 4th, 1857. He took Harriet with him. He's not married, needs someone to represent that lady there. She became the original lady to be called First Lady. Now, the reason I say that is because none of the ladies that lived in the presidential mansion, and it wasn't called the White House during the term that Harriet lived there, it was called the presidential mansion. None of the ladies that lived there before were ever called First Lady. The press called Harriet Lane the First Lady. Now we call them all First Ladies, but she was the first. So there's the newspaper article from Frank Leslie's Illustrated that calls her the First Lady in the land. Harriet Lane, the original First Lady. James Buchanan was perhaps the most experienced man ever to hold the office of presidency of this country. He's also gone down in history as probably the worst president, although I don't think it was his fault. It does look bad on your resume when you become president, and when you leave, you have 7 states less in the country that you were presiding over than when you got there. That doesn't look good on your resume. Not good at all. 5 of his 7 cabinet members resigned. That's not good. But his Congress didn't do anything. He suggested that they either arm the country and be ready for war or compromise with the South. He didn't do either one. So when Lincoln became president, Lincoln inherited a country that had no standing army. The Confederacy had an army. And everything was in a flux. Everything was up in the air because Congress under Buchanan wouldn't do anything. And of course, the president gets blamed for that. Just like the coach, if your team is bad, you get fired. Well, his Congress was bad. So this is her inaugural gown from the exhibit in Washington. She became First Lady at age 27. Her uncle was 56. She renovated the presidential mansion, which was in horrible condition when she arrived, exceeding the budget and charging everything to her uncle, who was very wealthy. So he paid for the renovations that were above and beyond the budget out of his own pocket. She bought flowers and entertainment back into the White House, the presidential mansion, hosted parties there, and opened a greenhouse next to the presidential mansion. And there's the greenhouse to the left of the presidential mansion, and there's an interior shot of it. Now back to Daniel Sickles. In 1859, Sickles shot and killed attorney Philip Key, son of Francis Scott Key. Ever heard of Francis Scott Key? Okay. Sickles was a womanizer, and he was with women all the time, even though he was married to Teresa. And he was frequently out of town. And he made no bones about the fact that he was running around. It was in the public knowledge. Social etiquette allowed married women at the time to go out with unmarried men as their escort so that she could go to parties while he was out. And it was Philip Key who escorted her on most of those occasions. Well, they ended up having an affair. Imagine that. And Sickles found out and killed Key in broad daylight in Washington. He shot him dead. And then he used temporary insanity as his plea, and he was found innocent. In fact, after the trial, there was more public disgust for his wife for having the affair than for him killing Philip Key. Double standard, you think? It's the first time that plea had been successful in a U.S. court. There's Sickles killing Philip Key. February 1860, Harriet was the hostess at the presidential mansion for a contingency of 74 people from Japan, including 3 Japanese ambassadors. And this is a picture of them after they left, opening all the gifts that the Japanese had presented to James Buchanan. And in 1860, Prince of Wales, Queen Victoria's son, visited, and they went to Mount Vernon. And this is a painting of their visit to Mount Vernon. So the government had a ship, a revenue cutter they called the USS Harriet Lane. So as mischievous as Harriet had always been in her life, there's no reason why she shouldn't continue that now. She decided that she was going to have a party on her ship. She hired a band and catered it and sent out all kinds of invitations. Well, her uncle kind of went berserk. He said, this is not your ship. This is a government ship. And he made her announce in all the newspapers that the party had been canceled. And she was very disappointed. Now, this is the USS Harriet Lane. Now, the USS Harriet Lane was captured by the Confederates during the American Civil War. And they renamed the ship the CSS Harriet Lane. She's the only person to have both a Union and Confederate ship named after her in the Civil War, but it was the same ship. So Harriet's agenda was, she was very outspoken. Surprise, surprise. She spoke her mind. She was taught that in those cigar smoking sessions that she was allowed to do when she was a little girl, or a youngster anyway, teenager. So she advocated for fair treatment for Native Americans. This was kind of outrageous in her day. She championed women's rights and was an admirer of Abigail Adams. But she also realized that in order to get women to vote, men would be the ones that would vote as to whether women got the vote or not. Now, why would men want to give women the right to vote? That wouldn't make any sense to a man who had to vote. And she realized that. And obviously it didn't happen in her lifetime. She wanted the president's house to offer art and entertainment, which it had never done before. Now this is precious. This is what one of the newspapers said about Harriet. Miss Lane's reign at the presidential mansion was one of complete charm. Nature, education, and experience were combined in the president's niece in such a manner as eminently to qualify her to meet the responsibilities that for years were to be hers. Miss Lane possessed great tact and a perfect knowledge of Mr. Buchanan's wishes. The charms in young womanhood still lingered about her, but to them were added a qualm rare in a woman of 50, so that during her residence in the presidential mansion, functions rose to the greatest degree of elegance. I knew that was why you're coming up here. At the time they said this, she was 30, and they said that she was great for a woman of 50. So she was probably pretty peeved, you think? So after being the first lady, and after James Buchanan left Washington, came back to Wheatland, she married Baltimore banker Henry Elliott Johnston. She had 2 sons, James Buchanan Johnston and Henry Elliott Johnston. James died at age 14. Henry died at age 15, both of rheumatic fever. Her husband died shortly after her two sons died. She was a great philanthropist. Her money came from her uncle's fortune. At the time of his death, she was his only heir. All her brothers and her sister had passed away. Her estate, when she died in 1903, was worth $11 million. That's considerable for 1903. Her donation of artwork became the foundation of the National Collection of Fine Arts at the Smithsonian Institution. That in itself is amazing. She founded the Harriet Lane Outpatient Clinic at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. In fact, the manual at Johns Hopkins is dedicated to Harriet Lane. Her contributions to the Episcopal Cathedral in Washington led to the founding of St. Albans School. I had a lady recently bought the Harriet Lane book from me at one of my events, and I said, well, what's your interest in Harriet Lane? She said, she started rattling off. She must have named 14 or 15 people that were either went to St. Albans, worked at St. Albans, contributed to St. Albans, on and on and on. Everybody in her family, everybody that she knew was tied into St. Albans. She left money to purchase James Buchanan's birthplace and erect a monument at Cove Gap near Mercersburg, and she built a statue to her Uncle James Buchanan in Washington. That's what the statue looked like. Probably wouldn't be a statue in Washington of James Buchanan if it hadn't been for Harriet. The Harriet Lane book is historical fiction, about 95% true. It's written in first person. All my novels are written in first person. So Harriet's telling her own story. There's the book. People ask me why I use a silhouette on the cover. I've seen at least 50 drawings of Harriet Lane. She looks different in every single one. So I don't know what she looked like. So I used the silhouette, got me around it. And there's her own private ship there at the bottom. Now, I want to talk to you just for a couple of seconds here about some of my other books. As I said, I like to write about persons that the average person has not heard of, or a subject. Virginian who might have saved Lincoln is about Abraham Lincoln's bodyguard, Ward Hill Lemon. Never heard of Ward Hill Lemon? There's 55,000 books on Abraham Lincoln, only 2 on the bodyguard. I wrote both of them. Amazing Legacy of James Hanger. Anybody ever heard of James Hanger? See, this is the kind of books I like to write about. James Hanger was the first amputee of the American Civil War. He started his factory making artificial limbs 1861. His company in 2022 is the largest manufacturer of artificial limbs in the United States, Hanger Incorporated. They have over 1 million patients every year. Nobody's ever heard of him. Dennis Hart Mahan, military tactics instructor at West Point. Anybody ever heard of him? If you go to West Point, there's a building named after him. Over 900 soldiers in the Civil War took tactics class from him at West Point, including almost 500 generals on both sides. So not only did those generals know how to attack these generals, but these generals knew how to defend their attacks because they all had the same teacher. Nobody's ever heard of him. Anybody heard of Mrs. Slater, the missing Lincoln conspirator? See what you can learn from my books? Life of Abraham Lincoln as President. I found this book in the Huntington Library in California, 2007, and never been published. It was written by Abraham Lincoln's bodyguard. I bought the rights to it and published it for the first time in 2010. Greatest Gun of the Agents, Lorenzo Seibert's 48-shot repeating rifle. Anybody ever heard of that gun? It had 8 barrels, 6 shots in each barrel, 22 caliber shots. It was a Confederate gun. It could be fired 48 times without loading. Can you imagine if the Confederates had that gun and the Union had single shot muskets? U.S. colored troops at Andersonville Prison. Most people didn't know there were colored troops at Andersonville Prison. Two of my children's books. These are my two children's books. The one on the right is about my grandson. My grandson's blind. He goes to Maryland School for the Blind in Bel Air, Maryland. He tells me, Grandpa, people think because I'm blind, I'm also deaf. So I put him in a story in the Civil War where a Confederate doctor was going to send blankets with typhoid fever germs to try to kill President Lincoln. These two guys are talking about it. My grandson's sitting there. And the guy said, maybe we shouldn't be talking about it in front of this little boy. The guy said, well, he's obviously deaf and dumb. So they blew the whole plot. He goes home, tells his mom, they get arrested, and he saves the Union. Not all are listed on my business card. My business card's too small to have all my books on it. All are available on my website, www.boboconnorbooks.com. Now, the Harriet Lane book is available in the lobby. If you go out and to the, what is it, little kiosk there, they'll sell you the book and I'll sign it for you. I'm going to be set up right out there when we get done. I'm writing a 5-book series on trials of people that did not go to trial. I don't read Civil War books, I read trial books. It dawned on me that some of the people in the Civil War should have gone to trial but didn't. My first 3 are published. The trial of John Wilkes Booth, he never went to trial. Trial of Jefferson Davis, he never went to trial. The government didn't want to try Jefferson Davis. Trial of Nathan Bedford Forrest. My next book is the trial of Colonel Dixon Miles. He was the commanding officer of the troops that surrendered at Harper's Ferry right before the Battle of Antietam. And the 5th one is not Civil War related. Trial of Lee Harvey Oswald. Did you know that the Dallas police questioned Lee Harvey Oswald for 22 hours, didn't take any notes, didn't have a stenographer there, and didn't have a tape recorder going? So we have no idea what they asked him and what he answered. On and on and on and on. What a boondoggle that thing is. I'm researching a book about Abner Doubleday. Ever heard about him? What do you know him for? Baseball. When we were growing up, we were taught that Abner Doubleday invented baseball. The name of my book is Abner Doubleday, the Civil War general who did not invent baseball. He absolutely did not invent baseball. He left 63 diaries at his death. Not one mentioned baseball. He wrote over 1,000 articles for magazines and newspapers during his lifetime. Never once mentioned the word baseball. He did not invent baseball. Researching a book about Henry Uhlke. Anybody know that name? Henry Uhlke was a photographer in Washington, best known for a drawing that he's in rather than one that he drew. But there's over 100 of his drawings and paintings hanging today in Washington. This is Henry Uhlke, closest to us, next to the end. In the Peterson house. He was an immigrant. What was he doing in the Peterson house? Oh, you have to read the book to find that out. Thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have and sell you a book or two out in the lobby.